Beyond the gate's spoilers tease that Samantha had been quietly weaving a plan behind Smitty's back, her mind working late into the nights, while everyone else in the house believed life was finally settling down. She didn't act out of malice. Her intentions were wrapped in the fragile hope of pulling everyone closer, of repairing something broken long ago. But her secrecy meant there would be consequences she couldn't yet imagine. The plan began with a single text message to Tyrell. She didn't dare speak it aloud at first. The air in the house was too heavy with unspoken tension. When Tyrell finally read her words, he understood instantly. She wanted to engineer a meeting between Martin and Smitty, a meeting neither man would agree to on their own. She knew the history between them was jagged, but she also knew that if they didn't face each other, the gaps in their family would never heal. Tyrell hesitated, knowing the risk, but his longing for the days when laughter filled the living room outweighed his fear. So he agreed. They started with small moves, subtle hints to each man, overlapping invitations, and carefully placed information that would bring them into the same orbit without either realizing it was orchestrated. Samantha's confidence grew with every step that went unnoticed. Tyrell played his part, sometimes acting as the messenger, sometimes simply nodding in support when she voiced her next move. The day of the meeting came faster than they expected. Smitty walked into the cafe thinking he was just picking up something for the workshop, and Martin arrived under the impression he was meeting Tyrell about a small errand. The moment their eyes met, there was a flicker of surprise, then tension, but the trap, if it could be called that, had already sprung. Samantha lingered at a nearby table, pretending to scroll through her phone while her heart pounded. She told herself this was the beginning of something better. The conversation was cautious at first, like stepping onto ice that might crack at any moment. But as Samantha joined in, her voice soft but steady, she spoke of her wish for the family to be whole again. She reminded them of the good times, the warmth they once shared. Smitty's jaw tightened, but something in his eyes softened. Against his better judgment, he agreed to give Martin a chance to come back home, if only for a trial period. That fragile peace lasted mere days. It was Jacob who shattered it. He arrived unannounced, carrying a worn envelope as if it were something too delicate to drop. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table toward Martin. The moment Martin saw it, he froze. The woman in the picture, June, had eyes that mirrored someone he thought he knew. "Where did you get this?" Martin's voice cracked slightly. Jacob didn't hesitate. He told the story as if it had been rehearsed, each detail hitting harder than the last. Martin's hands tightened around the photo until the edges bent. What Jacob revealed about June was not just unexpected, it was destabilizing. Martin didn't keep it to himself for long. That night, he told Smitty everything, his voice low but urgent. They talked late into the night, the words heavy with the weight of what they might mean for Samantha and Tyrell. Eventually, Martin made a decision. He called Jacob, his tone steady now, and asked to arrange a meeting. When he told Samantha and Tyrell, he chose his words carefully. He explained they would be meeting a woman who might be their biological mother. He didn't push excitement, he left room for doubt. But the words still hit Samantha like a stone to the chest. She stared at him, wide-eyed. "We have to find out the truth?" Her voice trembled, not from joy but from fear. Later, in the kitchen, she told Tyrell what she hadn't been able to say in front of Martin and Smitty, that even if June turned out to be their real mother, she didn't want to leave the life she knew. The thought of being torn away from Smitty and Martin, from the home she'd fought to preserve, made her chest tighten. Tyrell tried to reassure her, telling her this was just a step to confirm things, not a final decision. His voice was calm, but inside he was just as unsettled. He had no idea what kind of storm they were walking into. The day they met June, the air felt wrong from the moment they stepped inside the dimly lit room. June was not what either of them had imagined. She was sharp around the edges, her movements quick, her voice sometimes too loud. There was a tension in her posture that made Tyrell's shoulders stiffen. When her temper flared briefly but sharply, it left Samantha rattled. The woman who might be her mother seemed almost dangerous in that moment, and the uncertainty wrapped around her like a shadow. The conversation was clipped, awkward. By the time they left, Samantha had withdrawn completely, her earlier nervousness now a full retreat. The days after were worse. Samantha spoke less, avoided eye contact, and spent more time alone. Tyrell noticed the same heaviness in himself. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was fear of losing the small, fragile stability they had left. Smitty noticed too. He'd always been more perceptive than he let on, and he quietly shared his concern with Martin one evening. The two of them sat at the edge of the porch, speaking in low tones about the way the kids were changing. That's when they decided to act. It was a bold move, one that might upset Jacob, but they didn't see another choice. They asked to meet him again, this time with a direct proposal, a DNA test to settle the question once and for all. Jacob agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly, and Naomi helped arrange the testing. Days later, the results came in. Jacob and Naomi called Martin to share the news. June was not the biological mother of Samantha and Tyrell. For a moment, relief washed over Martin. It meant they wouldn't be separated, that the home they'd built would remain intact. But the relief was tangled with disappointment. The truth they'd been chasing was still out of reach, the answers still hidden. Martin shared the results with the others, and for a fleeting moment, there was a sense of safety. But somewhere else, June was holding the paper in her hands, her face twisted with disbelief. She shouted that it couldn't be true, demanding that the children be returned to her. And there was still that other question: why did the photographs look so alike? Two faces, nearly identical, yet the science said they weren't connected. Somewhere beyond the gates of what they knew, something remained unfinished, waiting to break through. June's voice echoed in the small apartment long after the paper slipped from her hand. She paced in sharp, uneven steps, the result clenched in her fist like a betrayal written in ink. She couldn't accept it. The resemblance in the photographs was undeniable, every curve of the jaw, the exact shade of the eyes. To her, science was lying, or someone had made sure the truth was buried. Martin didn't know that, not yet. He was still processing the strange emptiness that came after the relief. He had expected to feel free from the weight of uncertainty, but the unanswered questions lingered like a storm on the horizon. Smitty sensed it too. They spoke less now, but each conversation carried a quiet urgency, as if both men knew they hadn't reached the real end of this. Samantha, however, was different. For her, the result should have been the end of the matter. No biological link meant no obligation to step into a life she didn't want. But the way June had looked at her during their meeting intensity, the unspoken claim kept replaying in her mind. She found herself checking the locks at night, glancing over her shoulder during errands. Tyrell noticed, but he didn't know how to bring it up without making her feel worse. He had his own unease. The resemblance between June and Samantha wasn't something he could ignore either. He remembered the first time he saw the photo Jacob had shown Martin. His stomach had tightened with a recognition he couldn't explain. Jacob, on the other hand, had gone quiet after delivering the results. That in itself was strange. He had been the one to bring the photo, the one to stir the questions, and now he seemed to be waiting for something. Naomi asked him twice if he was going to follow up, and both times he said they should let things settle. But she caught him one night staring at the lab report with a look that wasn't relief, it was doubt. The tension built slowly. Martin tried to keep life steady for Samantha and Tyrell, suggesting family dinners, weekend projects, and short trips, but the normalcy felt thin. Smitty joined in, though his attempts at lightheartedness often fell flat. The kids smiled when they had to, but the shadow of June's outburst was still there. One evening, a letter arrived for Martin. No return address, no name, just a folded sheet inside. It contained another photograph, this time of June standing beside an older man neither Martin nor Smitty recognized. On the back, written in rushed handwriting, was a single line: "You're looking in the wrong place." Martin brought it to Smitty immediately. They went over the possibilities, their voices low, as if the walls themselves might repeat their words to someone else. The conclusion was unavoidable: someone was feeding them pieces of a larger puzzle, and if June wasn't lying about believing the children were hers, then there was more to her past than they'd been told. Samantha and Tyrell weren't supposed to see the letter, but Tyrell found it on the counter the next morning. He read it twice, then showed it to Samantha without a word. That night, she told him she couldn't shake the feeling that June was going to come back. Not to talk, but to take. The prediction wasn't far off. 2 weeks later, Jacob reached out to Martin, asking to meet in person. They met in the same cafe where Martin and Smitty had first been reunited. Jacob didn't waste time on pleasantries. "She's been asking around," he said, meaning June. "About the kids. About you. She's not letting this go." Martin felt a cold knot form in his chest. "The tests?" "I know," Jacob interrupted. "But she thinks they're wrong. And she's unstable right now." Naomi's worried. Back at the house, Martin and Smitty debated what to do. Smitty leaned toward confronting June directly, while Martin wanted to keep the children out of sight until things calmed down. Tyrell, overhearing part of their conversation, stepped in and argued that they couldn't hide forever. Samantha said nothing, just sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, her face unreadable. The next development came unexpectedly from Naomi. She called one evening to say she'd found something in an old medical record with June's name on it. There was a note in the file about a child born years ago, but the details were partially blacked out. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to reopen every question they thought they had answered. Martin showed the file to Smitty, and together they decided they couldn't avoid the truth anymore. They would talk to June, not to argue, but to demand the whole story. Tyrell offered to go with them, insisting they needed someone younger who could read her reactions without the baggage Martin and Smitty carried. The meeting took place in a neutral space. Jacob arranged it at a small community hall. June arrived late, her expression shifting between defiance and weariness. At first, she repeated what she'd said before. The children were hers, no matter what the papers claimed. But when Martin showed her the medical record, something in her eyes changed. She hesitated, glancing at Jacob, then back at Martin. For the first time, she admitted there were gaps in her own memory, periods of her life she couldn't fully account for. She claimed there had been arrangements made without her consent, people stepping in to make decisions she didn't understand at the time. Tyrell pressed her for specifics, but June shut down, her hands trembling. "They told me I couldn't have them," she whispered. "But no one told me why." It was clear she believed what she was saying. Whether it was true was another matter entirely. After the meeting, Martin felt no closer to the truth. The only new certainty was that someone they hadn't yet seen was part of this. Smitty suggested finding out who the man in the second photograph was. Tyrell volunteered to start asking questions quietly, while Samantha, despite her fear, agreed to keep an eye out for anyone following them. But whatever they were stepping into, it was moving faster than they realized. That night, as the house settled into uneasy sleep, a car idled half a block away, its headlights off, its driver watching the front door. The car outside didn't move for nearly an hour. Its engine finally went silent, but the driver stayed, a shadow behind tinted glass. Inside the house, no one knew yet that they were being watched, though Samantha stirred in her sleep, waking with the uneasy sense that something was wrong. By morning, Martin was already thinking about the man in the photograph. He called Jacob, pressing him for leads, but Jacob insisted he knew nothing more. Naomi, however, had a different reaction when Martin mentioned the man. There was a pause, the faint intake of breath, and then she promised to look into it. 2 days later, she called back with a name, Leonard Kane. He had once worked for a private agency that specialized in family mediation, a vague title that seemed to cover everything from legal custody cases to more questionable interventions. His connection to June went back more than 2 decades. Martin and Smitty pieced it together in the kitchen late that night. If Leonard had been involved in June's life at the time Samantha and Tyrell were born, he might have been the one to orchestrate their disappearance or their placement into another home. Whether June was complicit or not was still unclear. Tyrell wanted to confront Leonard directly. Smitty opposed it, saying they didn't know what kind of man they were dealing with. Samantha, quiet until now, simply said, "We have to end this. I can't keep wondering who's telling the truth." They decided to involve Jacob again, not because they fully trusted him, but because he had the resources to find Leonard without drawing too much attention. Jacob reluctantly agreed, and within a week, he had tracked Leonard to a remote property outside the city. The drive there was tense. Martin gripped the wheel tighter than usual. Smitty stared out the window, and the kids sat in the back, silent. When they arrived, the house looked empty, blinds drawn, no car in the driveway. But as they approached, the door opened just enough for a man to step out. Leonard was older than in the photograph, but his presence was commanding. He looked at them as though he had been expecting this visit for years. "You're here about the kids," he said without preamble. What followed was not a confession, but a story pieced together with careful omissions. Leonard claimed that June had indeed given birth to twins Samantha and Tyrell, but there had been complications, legal disputes, and questions about her ability to raise them. He said he had been hired to find them a better situation. "But the tests," Martin interjected, said there's no biological link. Leonard smiled faintly, almost pityingly. "Tests can be arranged. Results can be tailored. Sometimes it's safer that way." The words sent a chill through the group. If Leonard was telling the truth, then the paper they had trusted might have been a deliberate misdirection. But why? And by whom? When Martin pressed for proof, Leonard refused. He said too many people were still invested in keeping certain histories buried. Then, without warning, he stepped back inside and closed the door. The ride home was even quieter than the trip there. No one spoke until they were almost back in the city, when Tyrell finally said, "If he's lying, we'll never know. And if he's telling the truth, we still might never know." That night, Samantha sat with Martin on the porch. "I used to think knowing everything would make me feel safe," she admitted. "Now I just want to keep what I have." Martin didn't answer, but he put an arm around her shoulder, the gesture speaking more than words could. Over the next week, the surveillance had no strange cars, no lingering shadows. June made no further contact. Jacob and Naomi kept their distance, though Naomi sent one last message to Martin. Sometimes the truth isn't a single thing. Sometimes it's two things that don't fit together. Life returned to something resembling normal, but it was a fragile kind of peace. Martin and Smitty stopped discussing the case in front of the kids, deciding that some questions could remain unanswered without breaking the family they had fought to preserve. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the yard filled with the sound of cicadas, Samantha caught her reflection in the window. For a moment, she thought she saw someone else looking back, an echo of June's face, or maybe just her own features caught in the fading light. She blinked, and it was gone. Tyrell joined her outside, holding 2 mugs of tea. "We'll be okay," he said simply. And for the first time in months, Samantha believed it, not because the past had been resolved, but because, whatever the truth was, they were still together. Somewhere, beyond the reach of their quiet street, there were files in locked drawers, photographs in dusty boxes, and names on forgotten documents that could have told them everything. But those answers would stay hidden. For now, that was enough.